I am, he declared, loudly, as he reached for the hilt of his sword, and hung onto it for a moment. I am. It took only an hour or so to go through the whole of Ethelflaed's estate, a process that Osrith found incredibly satisfying. She instructed her men to leave everything, to not steal a single thing, for if Ethelflaed ever did have influence after her husband, in the end, she did not want any one of them hanged for even the theft of a clothes peg. Nothing seemed to indicate whence they might have fled, but Osrith did find something that she did take, and folded the ancient parchment up so she could conceal it inside her trouser waistband until she could look over it at leisure. A map in her office room seemed to suggest Ethelflaed had some sort of connection to Cester, and indeed, taking the road north would take them there. He spread it out on the large oak desk, poring over it, looking at the burrs in all compass directions, and Osrith moved to stand next to him and she looked at the markings. Saltwick was at the center. As she looked south, Gloucester was marked. Unlikely, Osrith suggested. Too far south and too close to Edward. Eardwulf looked across to her, as if wondering whether Osrith's support was genuine. When she carried on looking at the map, the man looked back too. East takes them back into Mercia, Danelaw, he commented. Maybe there? Because of the Lord Utard, you mean? Osrith said. You think he is in this? Can you conceive not? Who else would Ethelflaed trust? She looked back to the table again, her eye looking west. Would High-Will Didier give her shelter? Perhaps. But my feeling is north. Eardwulf traced his finger north. Cester. He tapped the parchment. Close to the sea, Northumbria further north. Choices. Good points, Osrith considered, and found herself agreeing. Of all of the directions they might have gone, north was her feeling too. There was another reason for Osrith to think Cester. Utard despised his elder son for adhering to Christianity. Utard, for he had been baptized thus, was the bishop of Cester. Was he seeing sanctuary with his son for Elfwin? Her nephew, Osrith thought, as she looked at Cester again on the map. She watched Eardwulf gather the map up and secrete it inside his jerkin, wondering on his claim. He seemed genuine enough, and his declaration that he was for Mercia could be nothing other than genuine. What if he did become lord? He was of Mercia, and plenty of men had taken the step into royalty through politic as well as battlefield circumstances, Sained MacAlpin, for one, Offa of Mercia for another. Yet, was he strong enough to hold the country? Edward was strong, and Eardwulf needed to be stronger. But Osrith suspected that he had not got the support of the other lords. Indeed, Burgard proposed his own son on the same course. That is, to be married to Ethelflaed's daughter, and even Burgard's opponents in the Widden might not support their enemy's challenger on the basis that Eardwulf challenged, even if his claim of Elfwin had apparently been endorsed by poor, broken Ethelred before he had died. Which, of course, it had not. Plus, Edward was in the position where even if Eardwulf had everything going for him, he still could put him asunder. Not a strong candidate, Osrith thought as the men ate what they could find in the kitchens. Livestock had yet to be slaughtered, and Osrith had seen none, which might suggest Saltwick had been abandoned for some time. Yet, cheese sat in the pantry and milk that was not yet sour stood on a cold stone. The estate had been abandoned 2 days at the most. Rest, gather your strength, Eardwulf commanded, clearly showing his skill as a leader, and Osrith found a chair on which to sit with the autumn's sunlight irradiating her face. Osrith, you do have a plan? Elfrith sat beside her, as the men continued to go through the kitchen for anything else they could find to eat. Because someone has murdered the Lord Ethelred, and I am convinced that we are being set up for this. Osrith turned her head and put her hand on Elfrith's. She had suspected the same, and taking this line, of loyal, dogged warriors to a man nominally for Mercia also gave her time to find out who would frame them, and more importantly, why. I do. She nodded to her deputy, and he stood, relieving Oshir of a large chunk of bread, tearing it in two, and giving half to Osrith. Their warrior frowned at first, but then Osrith stood and clapped him on the arm. See if there is more. Take what you can. We will need it. 88,888,888. North took Eardwulf and his guards upon an ancient pathway which connected the estuary with the beginnings of the Severn River just north of Salop. It had been hard going up until that point, and Osrith had nearly fallen from the sure-footed Morning Star as they went at speed over uneven ground. Once they had passed the Wrekin, to the east, the way was getting easier, and she hung on to the bridle as her horse picked out the best way. "Of course, we may be going wrong," Heod called over to Osrith, nervously, as they rode behind Eardwulf. "The Lady Ethelfled could be anywhere." "It is not our choice," Osrith replied. "It is the Lord Eardwulf's." And it made little difference, as far as Osrith could see. Not finding Elfwin and whoever was with her meant that whatever happened in Aylesbury would result in a new lord in the absence of Eardwulf. Edward may hold the power, but he risked civil war. Mercia was not Wessex, and everyone from the Witten lords to the Shawls and even the slaves knew it. And if she was found? Perhaps Ethelfled was even now on her way back to Aylesbury with her daughter, by a different route, and would be proclaiming her Ethelred's kin. Or, was she proposing a different course? Osrith still stood by her ghastly claim that her brother could take the lordship, and how better to uphold his claim than marrying Elfwin himself. Ahead of them, 2 days later, and signs of people on the move by foot were starting to reveal themselves. The poor, of course, always travelled by road, but there seemed a regimented order of disturbances. Fires, long dead and scattered to try to disuse them, were often not far away from shelter and water. People were travelling north in an organised fashion. Eardwulf knew this, and Osrith had to admit the man had been right. So what would happen when they found them? A fight, of course, and Osrith began the process of steeling her mind of emotion as she thought of a possible future confrontation between her men and her brothers. Stealth would be a better prospect, she advised Eardwulf when they next stopped for their horses. But the man shook his head. "I have seen you fight, Osrith," he said, firmly. "Why else would Miral have suggested you and your men?" Osrith smiled, with satisfaction. So she had been right. Miral had been in alliance with Eardwulf for the sake of independence. Did he support Eardwulf in his claim? Miral was no fool, and not supporting Eardwulf would have given their cause yet another enemy, powerful enough to side with Edward if he had been snubbed, and put himself forward to be Mercia's puppet. "You were right," Osrith told him, as the miles flew under their horses' hooves. Worm, a hamlet, north of Salop, had provided them with food, and they were now close to Whitchurch, where Eardwulf planned for a half-rest for them. A whole night was out of the question, he explained to Osrith. If they had Elfwin with them, the girl would need rest, and he needed to gain an advantage on their head start. And 5 days after leaving Saltwick it would seem that the Mercian commander's strategy had paid off, for a group of riders appeared on the horizon. At first, Osrith thought that the group was coming toward them, and hailed her men be alert. But they were closing in for a different reason. Eardwulf and his guard were closing in on the riders. Not very quickly, it had to be admitted, and if Finan was with them, Osrith considered, he would certainly have seen them by now. Which is why Osrith suggested a sleight of hand. She and 2 others would split off and take a path through the trees, overtaking Elfwin, if indeed that was whose riders they were, and turning to head south. The riders would then be between Eardwulf and Osrith, and would have to slow down and meet them. Especially if Osrith did not reveal herself immediately. This would give them the advantage. Elfkin and Egelfrith rode with her. Elfrith had proposed accompanying Osrith, and it was only after they had left, to ride through deeply wooded country, that she thought his offer might have been to do with something other than the strategy. She would be fine, sickness would pass, so she was given to understand, and apart from a little tiredness, she was as good as ever she had been. It was Elfwin. Egelfrith was the one who had spotted that the riders had stopped, and Osrith had slowed down, so their horses rode across the ridge above slowly and with as little sound as possible. As they passed, she saw 8 people in a clearing, resting, eating, doing something which relied on them not being on horseback, and indeed horses were tied to trees and figures seemed to be in no hurry to leave immediately, which they might have been if they had suspected they were being pursued. As they passed onwards and overtook them, Osrith peered down, trying to see who else was in the clearing. 5 adults, Osrith discerned 6, perhaps, and 2 children. One of whom, Osrith could tell, with bright, fair hair, as being Elfwin. Though she had never met the girl, the child, of maybe 11 or 12, had the same stance as her mother, long-limbed and tall, and she moved as Ethliad did, long strides, as if she was in charge of all of the people with her. Which indeed she very well might be. And Osrith's suspicions were confirmed about her retinue as they followed the ridge east, before it headed north again, and she glimpsed, in his finery, her brother. Onliutad would go on a rescue mission dressed in his arm rings and war armor, though his helmet was on the ground now, and being inspected by another small figure, another child, Osrith guessed. So it was with astonishment then, that as Osrith made to pull away from the scene, to ride further north, and then turn back, that she realized that Elfwin's group had been joined by more riders. They had stopped just short of the clearing, and ranged out in a line side by side. It was Eadgulf, with Elfrith, Ossier and Heod beside him. They were about to challenge Utad for Ethelflaed's daughter. So, instead of north, Osrith bade Eglfrith and Elfkin take their horses down the ridge very slowly, and head on to the road coming back up to the rear of the group. The same plan, just far sooner than Osrith imagined she would be carrying it out. And Osrith watched. Eadgulf was talking to the group, had stepped out from the line and was talking to Utad, who had stepped away from his men too. Osrith could see his warriors, Elfwin, and a boy, black-haired. There was an older girl, and beside the warriors a woman. Ethelflaed, she wondered, but the woman wasn't tall enough. And then, her hood came down and the morning sunlight betrayed the truth. It was Eadith, Ethliad's lover, and Eadgulf's sister. Beside her, and holding her hand was Elfwin. Was this plot known to Eadgulf? Had he got his sister to ingratiate herself with the men, seduce them, seduce Utad? Was it a plan, such as once described in a story from long ago in Mediterranean lands, of a sieging army leaving the siege, only to present their enemies with the gift of a large horse, just large enough to conceal warriors, who sprang from the horse in the dead of night and admitted their army? It didn't seem so. Eadgulf, now crossing towards Eadith, was met with a bristle of sword points, which caused him to stop, and he conceded before them. It looked to Osrith that he was trying to negotiate, but those behind the swords were holding them fast. "Come on," Osrith beckoned, leading Morningstar with her down a path which took them gently behind the ridge and in the direction of the party. Not one guard was looking in their direction, but that did not mean anything. Her brother was a skilled strategist, someone would be there somewhere. And that someone was a guard, who had taken that moment to have a piss by an alder tree. Eglfrith dispatched him and, as he dropped without a scream onto the carpet of autumn leaves underfoot which thankfully muffled much of the sound, Elfkin tied up the horses and spread out like Osrith was miming, so that they were approaching the group on 3 sides. She was close enough now that, if Elfrith and Osrith had agreed a signal, he would have been able to see her. She glanced to one side and saw Elfkin stalking much the same as she was stalking. Elgfrith, lean legs pushing him silently in the direction of the campfire, stooped to take up 3 of the weapons lying on the blankets, a sword and 2 sixes, stowing them in his leather belt after nodding at his find, for they were fine indeed. Ossier and Elfrith were now on either side of Eadgulf, as Utad's warriors stepped towards them, and Osrith saw a young boy who was with them turn. He had seen her. There was no point in pretending to hide, and the boy's wide eyes fixed on her as she stepped towards them, and tried to rid from her mind whose hand he was holding. Finan was fully focused on acting with Utad, and if he did notice a silent tug to his wrist he did not acknowledge it. Numbers favored Eadgulf, Osrith had to admit, though they were only 5, and the party 10 warriors. For some, like the guard killed just beyond them, looked as if they had come from Salt Wicks. There would be a skirmish, and with children about, the advantage was definitely theirs. Osrith crept further forward and her line was converging with Elfkin's pathway, as they sought to tread even closer, but it seemed the boy had alerted them, and, as one, Finan, Osferth and Sifrik turned and bore down on them, swords raised. Eglfrith had managed after 2 strokes to get Osferth onto his back, grinning at the baby monk as he poked his blade towards them. At the same time, the belligerents had made Utad draw both Elfwin and the black-haired boy to him, raising a sword towards Oshir and Elfrith who, to their credit, had not moved. And Elfkin was being fought by Finan, but Osrith did not dare to turn to look. For one thing, Sifik was bearing down on her, his blade flashing with the sun's rays, almost blinding her. He would have struck her in two had she not sprung out of his way, Bué between his shoulder blades, as Osrith grabbed an arm and held it at his back. She had seen him fight better, Osrith thought, as she remembered her time fighting Sifik over his wife who had taken a liking to Osith at the inn in Winchester. A vicious comeback was already on her tongue, and she would dearly have liked to have used it, but she was not about to let herself be discovered here. There was a plan much bigger than herself afoot for Mercia and she would not ruin it for insults. "You will not keep the girl from me," Eardwulf was saying. "Look, my men have bettered yours. We are prepared to walk away with the Lady Elfwin, as were her father's wishes." "It is true," Elfrith added, "the Lord Ethliad did indeed approve the match." A lie, Osith thought, but a relative one. Better the girl to be taken with Eardwulf rather than whatever plot this was that would take her north. Far better to scupper Ethelflaed's plans. But then, someone stood between Utad and Eardwulf. It was Eadith. And, to Osrith's horror, she heard the Lord Eardwulf's sister accuse Eardwulf of murdering Ethliad. It was then she knew as cold, hard anger flooded over her like a waterfall in the depths of winter. Eardwulf had been playing them for a fool, letting them accompany him, get them away from Aylesbury. His first act as lord, once solemnized, no doubt, would be to execute them all for treason. Osrith held Bué close to Sihtric, who struggled under her hold as she watched the scene closer. Eardwulf was accused of not only murder but stealing the Ring of Mercia's lords and king right back to Penda. "If you do not believe me, look in the pouch that he carries around his neck," Eadith demanded. And Eardwulf did not stop his captain, Heard, from taking it from him. Perhaps Eardwulf expected Heard to lie as the young man felt inside the leather pouch, that he commanded loyalty for Mercia, that it was a fait accompli that he was lord already. But out came the huge emerald, which must have been traded and traded again before it ended up in that middle kingdom of Britain and placed into a setting for the ruler of that land, and it suddenly made sense to Osrith. Have the heir, Elfwin, in this case, have the token of rule, the ring. Have a weak lordship and an empty throne, and all that was needed was a man seemingly willing to meet all the criteria. Except that he hadn't. For, when Heard threw the ring towards Eadith, it was then that Eardwulf struck, running his sword so forcefully through his captain's frame that the blade came through him again. And it had been that, for Osrith. Odious man that he was, she could never have countenanced that he would take such casual revenge, and she pushed Sihtric out of the way and ran to him, thrusting Bué through the man's neck, screaming her rage as she did so. Eadith gave out a shriek of fear, as blood covered Osrith's face, as vengeance for the once boy she had trained was precipitated in fury and anger. When she had finished, a good deal of blood covered Osrith, and she stood back, before spitting on his body. Later, Osrith would think on her murder, and not know where the strength of her ferocity had come from. But for their commander to do away with one of his own captains, so casually, so arrogantly, it was shameful. She turned to the group now, as Elfrith banded to her side. Next to him, Oshir and Egelfrith. Behind them, there seemed to be some kind of stalemate between Elfkin and Finan, who had stopped combating when Eadith had spoken. Finan did not resist when Elfkin strode over to be at Osrith's side. "Who is your captain?" Utad demanded. "Who speaks for you?" Elfrith took a sideways glance to Osrith and then stepped forward. "I do," he confirmed. "It is not the way I would have intended justice for my comrade." He gestured towards Heard, as Osrith's gratitude glowed inside. "The Lord Eardwulf planned uprising, and, as you yourself admitted, lady, he had killed the Lord Ethliad, our lord and leader," he added, "to usurp his place, and framing my company in the deed." He nodded to Osrith's men and she wondered why he had never risen to captain. He took a step towards Utad. "Do you agree justice has been served here?" And it was now Elfrith's personable, charismatic manner came into his own. Even Utad seemed to be unmoved to speak, for his usual tactic was to wrest power from others. But here, now, he let Elfrith speak. Yes, Utad agreed. Justice has been done. Mercia has been saved, not just from Danes, but from Wessex. He stood beside Elfrith. We will make to the city, and inform the Witan that, in the line of his duty, the Lord Earnulf was tragically killed, and has been buried in the land he loved best. Utad glanced at Eadith, who still had her hands to her face in horror. She looked back to him, and nodded. Do you, men of Mercia, swear to your land? To Mercia? And then, as one, all four of Osrith's men stood about her, Ossier and Elfkin, Egelfrith, and Elfrith, and cried, We swear. Finan, Citric, bury the body. Utad looked across to Eadith, and paused. She nodded, slowly at first, and then more vigorously. He turned to Elfrith. We are ceased, Utad said. Come with us back to Aylesbury, and I hold that none of my men will attack yours, as long as none of yours will attack mine. And Utad took a quick gaze to Osrith as he said that, as she stood flanked by her men, holding swords in her defense. Agreed, Elfrith replied, looking Utad up and down. And we will bury our captain. He nodding to Heod, and he did not even have to ask Egelfrith and Ossier to take Heod with them. They simply peeled away and knelt to Heod, Ossier placing two hands on the dead captain's shoulders, with Egelfrith touching his forehead. We need a priest, he said, and looked around, spying a person he had spotted shortly before, a monk with a sword in his hand. Before Osrith could say anything, Egelfrith was stalking over to Osferth, who turned round to him quickly, as if expecting another fight from him. Utad had turned too, and he watched as Osrith watched, Egelfrith persuade Osferth to come with him, over to Heod, and her heart melted as Osferth knelt to their dead captain and, pulling the man's hands together, held them in his own and said the Lord's Prayer. What was his name? Osferth asked, and Egelfrith told him. May your servant Heod sit with you, O Lord, in peace for all days eternal. And then he stood, and watched as Ossier began to dig a grave right there beside Heod. Osrith turned away. If it had not been Earnulf for his cowardly, self-satisfied, casual disregard for everything, even basic humanity, Osrith felt that, really, she would have flown at her brother. All hatred and bile and anger she felt came out, released in an instant by another lord paying the price for his own betrayal of his men. They settled to camp for the night in that clearing, Elfkin and Ossier taking the first watch around the section of land where they would rest for the night. A natural rise of land separated Osrith's men and Utad's, and no doubt her brother would post guards of his own. She could not help it. Having got the campfire going herself, and having Elfkin raid their horses' panniers for the food they had liberated from Saltwick, Osrith then made an attempt on rabbit, until tagged seeks slipped and she skinned the edge of her thumb. Elfrith gently took the seeks from her, and led her from the fire, and Osrith couldn't help but sit next to him, the effort to remain awake being almost too much for her to bear. Egelfrith managed the rabbit, and had managed to find another, and Osrith watched as he expertly boiled the flesh of the animals, the smoke from the wood fire curling parallel with the trunks of the ash trees and filtered its way into the canopy of trees above. Why you? Elfrith asked her, as she leaned against a tree. It was surprisingly comfortable, but she leaned from it as her deputy sat beside her. Why did you choose to do it out of all of us? Because I am not a true mercen, Osrith said. None of you could see Eardgulf as anything other than a lord. And when you return to Aylesbury, none of you have to bear that guilt. It is not my fight. It's his. She looked across to Utad as he sat with his men. No guilt he for murder, as the children dozed around him. No guilt for her imprisonment, her torture. She watched as Elfrith looked over to the camp again, and she followed his gaze, over the young children, the boy nestled beside Osferth, the girl asleep beside Stiora. They must have all been with Elfwin, wherever she had been hidden, and her guess that the boy was Ethelstan, Edward's eldest child. How it seemed like only yesterday when Edward had enthused on the flush of his first love, Ecgwin, Ethelstan's mother. Beamflout was being fought for, Ethelfled was only a girl in her first flush of marriage. Where was she now? Osrith did not know. Did she know of her husband's death? Of his murder? It was why she could not flee north, as she wanted to, with more than enough intelligence to satisfy Constantine. If she did that, her men, these good men of Mercia, would be blamed for both Eardwulf's and Ethelred's deaths. And her islet on Finan, happy in his rest, as he ate and drank, and laughed with Sitrick. And watched, too, that he got to his feet and ran his hand through his hair as Eadith crossed to them. He leaned towards her as she spoke and, to Osrith, she did not look like a woman that was now particularly concerned that her brother had been murdered. She drew her eyes away, not quickly enough, however. Not quickly enough not to see the man that she loved in the whole world place a tender hand on Eadith's shoulder. When she looked back to the fire, and Egelfrith still tending the supper, she turned her head slowly back to Elfrith. "My brother is the best chance Mercia has of independence from Wessex," Osrith concluded. "He will hold Edward to account, and heal the rift. Plus, he is half Mercian too, through his mother. He has a blood claim, as well as a moral one." "Your brother?" Elfrith's face betrayed confusion, and Osrith nodded towards Utad. "My brother," she emphasized. "My kindly, generous, just brother, who," she broke off, and gripped Bue's hilt. "He is, and always has been, the Lord Ethelred's cousin. Can you not see him commanding Mercia's best?" She nodded to her men. "Can you not see his holding Mercia against Edward? Then tell him." Elfrith urged. "Tell him that he should be proposing himself." But Osrith shook her head. "No." Osrith shook her head, no longer afraid to tell anyone about her time past, in that woe-begotten land of Wessex. "I do not trust myself, not yet. It was only by a fraction that my will drove me to Eardwulf this day." "I saw his hand," he replied. "I staked him to a guard table with a spear, for he was dead drunk that night," Osrith replied, then turned from him, and leaned against the ash tree again. She felt the leaves crunch beside her, and she turned her head, watching Elfrith cross their camp and appear at the higher ground before Utad's. "Captain," Elgfrith said, and handed Osrith a cloth, in which was wrapped a rabbit leg. He handed her a skin containing water, then nodded to her. "You were brave today, Captain," Egelfrith said. Osrith gave him a thin smile. She had not been. It should be her, now, at a neutral meeting place, forwarding the idea she had long had to Utad's face. "Should I have done it, Egelfrith?" she asked, looking into his honest, brown eyes. Egelfrith frowned and shook his head. "I fear not," he replied, though his face showed confusion. He was conflicted. All who stood there that day knew that beyond thieves and murderers were traitors, and Eardwulf had betrayed a man lower in status than himself. He had been a low coward. All knew it. "Yet, he had betrayed us," Osrith replied. "When he called us to ride, what he did do was leave the death of the Lord Ethelred at our feet. When we return to Aylesbury, that is the charge that has been laid on us. And I cannot even bring Eardwulf to justice, to make him admit what he did was wrong." She looked at Egelfrith again. Poor man, he had only come over to give her supper. "Thank you," Osrith nodded, then bit into the rabbit thigh. It crumbled from the bone as she raised it to her lips and the flesh tasted exquisite. "You have skill in cooking," Osrith said. "I like to cook, Captain," he replied. "My mother is a cook with the royal household. She taught me." Osrith glanced at the movement by the trees, and Oshir approached them. "Then I will not detain you," Osrith said, stiffly as she cast an eye over to Elfrith again. If anyone could be an ambassador to her brother it was Elfrith. Then, she watched him return to their own camp. The Lord Utad has said their plans had now changed, and they were returning to Saltwick in the morning, for somewhere where Elfwin may be safe. "Her mother's estate," Osrith replied, grimly. "Indeed," Elfrith replied, "and we are to swear loyalty to her, as the Dowager Lady of Mercia." "You may," Osrith thought. "I will not." "And of my plan?" She caught Elfrith's expression. "He will be loyal to Mercia, that I know." "It is not that," Elfrith replied. "He has said that you must submit to trial for the death of the Lord Eardwulf." and that made Osrith get to her feet. Tired, both in her body and mind, she stood and faced Utad's camp. "You do not need to do this. Fly to Alba." But Osrith turned to him, sharply. "I will do no such thing." Osrith replied, hotly. "I swore to Mercia, Ethelred was as much my lord as anyone, though he was dissolute and lazy." She craned over to see if she could see her brother, over at his camp, but could not see him from her vantage point. "So, you will fetch him," Osrith said, and saw Elfrith's face. "Please." And so her friend crossed the camp again, finding Utad, who was in conversation with Ethelstan, as Osrith followed. Had he not recognized her then? The thought drifted into her mind as Elfrith stood before her brother. One look in her direction and Utad stalked across to her. "You wish to speak, so your captain said," Utad said. There was a sneer in his voice and a mocking leer, and Osrith withdrew her sword, thrusting Bue into the soil before them. Serpent breath joined Bue, and it looked as if the two weapons were facing off to one another. "I am their captain," Osrith corrected him. "Elfrith speaks as my deputy, though he temporarily took command of the division, as you saw." She turned to look at him, and saw that beside Elfrith her men were ranged, watching them. "I will submit to trial, if that is what is needed," Osrith continued, waiting for Utad to recognize her, to fly at her, for what she had done to him at Bibbenberg, for the Scottish plot that had delayed his siege, that had likely caused his failure to capture the prize he held most dear, for burning the deeds that proclaimed him lord, for thwarting him on many, many occasions. Thankfully, it was dark enough that Finan did not see her, and she made sure she had positioned herself away from the camp. Unlike her men, Utad's warriors were not ranged behind him. "It is I said," Utad replied, simply, then made to withdraw his blade. "Over." And Osrith smirked inwardly. It would mean he would have to speak, too, and he would not wish to have to justify himself to the Mercian lords over why he was in fleeing with Lord Ethelred's daughter and King Alfred's grandson. "Then my men, who are wholly innocent," Osrith reminded him, "will be condemned in my stead. Eardwulf set them up to take the blame for Ethelred's death." She looked at Serpent Breath. 3 times now Bue had lived up to her name and had claimed victory over the snake. She could pick her up again and fight her brother for a 4th time. She stepped closer to Utad. "Do what you will on my account, but let it be known at the Witan that they are not to blame. Let," she waved her hand towards Edith, his sister, "proclaim what she saw. If she saw, others might have. It will not be on my account that they suffer. I am their leader." It was clear to everyone here that I take responsibility for Eardwulf's death. Utad looked at her for a moment. Still no recognition, Osrith thought. Had she changed so much? "I have no influence," Utad scorned. "Though I say, here and now, it is over." "And my men wrongly maligned?" she asked, hotly. "You have every influence," Osrith protested. "No longer is Eardwulf pursuing the Lady Ethelflaed's daughter. Burgod's claim through his son is pitiful. So, from what I can see, you have the strongest claim to the throne yourself. Marry Ethelflaed, if that is what is needed, and I can see a union of 2 kingdoms rather than a civil war. For then surely Alfred's dream will be over, as will the dream of many you hold dear." When he said nothing, Osrith added, "There is a big independence movement. Your name has been spoken many times." "King of Mercia?" He laughed at the words. But even now, Osrith could see there was intrigue in his eyes. "Or you can fight me again, in which case, it will be to me." Osrith knew she was being provocative, but she needed to be. Bibbenberg was the only thing on Utad's mind, and to consider Mercia as somewhere he could rule justly was not in the sphere of his mind. "Osrith?" he asked. It was the first time she considered that he had ever said her name. But she held up a hand as he looked with astonishment on his face. "Go, now, to my men and tell them that they are good men and have stood true to their captain," she insisted. "That I submit to your justice." "You submit to my justice?" Utad repeated, as Osrith stood unmovingly before him. "You accept that you will make a claim to rule Mercia?" But Utad shook his head. "If I do that, It will be a lifetime before my son will be old enough to inherit the throne. I cannot then bid for. And even if you do bid for Bibbenberg, who is to say that you will have it? Vigor is strengthening, and he may yet will to want to rule. But there could be another. Uhtred stared at her. You? Do you think I am in Mercia for a sightseeing tour? Uhtred laughed, despite himself. These men are innocent, of both Eardwulf's murder, and of Ethelred's murder. Even if I did come before the weak and disunified lords that make up Mercia's Witan, I would not be listened to. And ever, Edward would strengthen and invade. And what she was about to say appalled her, even in her own mind. If you have any remorse for what you did to me, what you allowed that man to do to me, you will claim the throne for yourself. Abdicate at a time that suits you, when another strong leader shows up. But do not abandon the country for vanity. This time it was Uhtred who was lost for words. He stood before Osrith and stared at her. Then, he took a step towards her. Maybe now, maybe after all of this, now was the time he was going to lay a path for peace between them, reconcile after all that had gone between them. But he did not. Instead, he put his hand to serpent breath. You are here on behalf of Constantine, Uhtred accused. I will not deny it. Wealth must be found to support Thyra and Bocca's daughter. She must eat silver and sleep on a gold bed, for all the money you have stolen from me over the years, Uhtred growled, then looked across to Elfrith, scanning the faces of Osrith's warriors. What is her name? Edra, Osrith said. Your name, Uhtred replied. I wasn't using it at the time. Uhtred stared at her for a moment, before heaving serpent breath out of the earth. I will do all I can for Mercia's warriors. I will withdraw the need for a trial, he added, for their benefit. As for us. There is no us, Osrith shot back. There could not be, and in her mind the wall of division, which had temporarily been removed, shot back into place.